Hey, welcome to the Vintage Vibe, where this week we're taking a peek at some little bookshelf speakers. I mean, as modest as they look, don't underestimate these. These are a pair of EPI 100Vs. Now, this design, not this particular pair, dates back as far as about 1960. In fact, this was what was called a module speaker, and it was designed by Winslow Burho. Now, for those who are really into vintage audio, that's a name that goes way back in speaker design. I mean, at the time of Bozak and all the other big names, he's been designing speaker as well since I think there was a speaker. And this was his module speaker, is what he called it. And it was designed to be an extraordinary little bookshelf speaker. In fact, the ultimate, some would say, bookshelf speaker on the cheap. So these would give a pair of Advents a real run for the money, or that was the idea. And the concept was to create this modest speaker that basically was crossoverless. So the woofer and the tweeter, which we'll take a peek at in a moment, are actually designed of similar efficiency. And the woofer kind of fades out or disappears at about 1800 hertz, which is where the tweeter naturally picks up. So there's a very small cap on the tweeter, but that's about it. So for all intents and purposes, no crossover. And they're a unique sounding speaker. We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the design. We'll talk about what you should expect if you happen to hunt for a pair of these little guys. How much do they cost, and whether or not they deserve a place in your vintage audio collection. All that and a little bit more right here on the Vintage Vibe.
Epicure Products International. Let's face it, these speakers look, well, kind of plain. But the concept of having, well, a tweeter and the accompanying woofer matched together with the same efficiency, and really the need to only have the bare essentials when it comes to crossovers was, well, kind of different. But on face value, a basic 8-inch woofer in an acoustic suspension cabinet with a foam surround, yada yada yada, doesn't seem all that different, does it? But the fact that Winslow Burho designed this compact speaker to be, well, really one of the ultimate bookshelves warrants at least a listen. Wouldn't you agree? And hopefully the listening experience is more exciting than, well, this vinyl veneer. But we have to remember these were designed to be obtainable for almost anyone. They did pack, though, some neat features like a phenolic dome tweeter that incorporated ferrofluid for cooling and dampening. And it was said that these inverted dome tweeters were extremely easy to listen to. And the beauty of a bookshelf speaker is they really can be enjoyed absolutely anywhere.
All right, so I've got my glasses on so we can do surgery with my wife's serving knife. She'll never know. So the glasses are so we don't put the little knife through a pair of the drivers. So we've got, first and foremost, a grill that is made out of like a plastic, a resin actually. And then you've got your grill cloth on it and the newer style EPI logo. What do I mean by newer style? The P has a sin wave going through it. The original ones, which were called the 100Ms, had the circular EPI logo. So this is telling me these are the second version. There was also, besides the 100Bs, 100Ws, which would have been walnut. You would have to forego the lovely simulated walnut veneer. I don't know if you want to do that. I mean, simulated walnut. This is where it's at, baby. And in the 80s, the last rendition, I think, was called the A100s. So what can I tell you about these? First rendition had a front baffle board that was made out of masonite board. These, nice and solid, half-inch thick HDF board, so high density fiber board, rather than the cheap chipboard, which would have been very common in most speakers at that time. The cabinet itself on these ones, this is going to be 3/4 inch thick HDF again, well braced. They're heavy. They're about 27 pounds each, which is pretty substantial for, again, a bookshelf speaker. And the woofer on these looks a little bit different than the originals, the 100Ms, because they don't have the butyl or the rubber surround. These have got the foam surrounds. Now, I know people go, oh, foam surrounds. Yeah, that's something you're gonna have to watch out for in terms of maintenance, because the foam in this time period would have just disintegrated. It would have fallen apart. They went to foam because there was more springiness, which is good for compliance, and the woofer would be able to move more freely. However, the trade-off was foam wasn't perfected and it rotted away. But certainly it would have been more springy than kind of using the cloth surrounds or having the dope, cloth surrounds or the rubber butyl, so on and so forth. But that's the drawback. Number two, you've got an inverted tweeter up here, which looks different than the first generation tweeter, which we'll talk about in a moment. So this is an inverted dome. And the idea here was to create a speaker that had, very good dispersion, wide dispersion, and had a good bandwidth, was fairly neutral, and sounded great with really any type of music, whether it was jazz or whether it was rock and roll. We'll talk about whether that's the case in a moment. What else can I tell you about this little speaker? Well, we'll turn it around and we'll take a look at the back next. Okay, so we're turning them around. We're going to take our time because they are plugged in right now to my Fez Audio 300V, and I don't want those wires to pop out and to short the tube amp. That'd be a bad thing. So very original looking on the back here. You've got all the stickers in place. Now, wait a minute, that don't look too original. They wouldn't have come with banana binding posts first and foremost. You would have had on these those god awful screw down, thingamabobbies that you find on like Advent speakers, you find on Bose 901s, you find on the lovely funky Empire Grenadiers. You know which ones I'm talking about. They got a little nuts, you screw them down, a little spiky thing on the back, and they're always missing. So in terms of maintenance, make sure that they're not missing. Otherwise, you're gonna have to change out the binding post likely to something like this. And to get at these, because the back is sealed, you're going to have to likely go in through the front where the woofer is to put something like that in place. So that to me is a plus, and I don't knock these speakers in terms of originality for new binding posts. Up top here, we've got a little sticker that says enclosed material blank. I know there's something in there, but they haven't marked it. And then it says all exposed panels are high density particle board. Side panels are laminated with scuff resistant vinyl veneer. Groovy. And then we go down here, we got the EPI logo, Model 100V, little serial number on them. And they say they're Epicure Products Incorporated. That's the EPI, Epicure Products Incorporated, from Newburyport, Massachusetts. I can't say it. From Mass. Same place that I think Advent came from. Mass. Good old Mass. Really kind of nice, again, cabinets. I gotta bring my attention to that again. That's thicker than my thumb. That's gotta be about 3/4 inch. And again, fairly heavy. I'm gonna guess there's some bracing in there. Quite impressed with that for acoustic suspension. They're not tiny. They're about 10 inches across, 10 inches deep, and maybe 18, or 20 inches tall. So that's not too shabby. Now let's talk about specs. Modestly about 50 watts. Frequency range about 45 hertz to 18,000 hertz. That's not so bad again for a small bookshelf speaker. In terms of maintenance, what can you expect with these guys here? Well, they have, again, the foam surround. So we already have addressed that. And you're going to have to, again, remove the speaker to be able to get at those, to do those. That's not a big deal because all of your kind of screws are right there in the face. Easy to pop these guys out. The tweeters are ferrofluid cooled, at least the second gen and third gen, not the first, but these later ones. Why is that a maintenance item? Well, ferrofluid can dry up. And if they have dried up, and you happen to go to drive these speakers really hard, you can pop your speakers. So just pay attention if you're going out and buying a pair, give them a listen, make sure those speakers are still operational because, again, if the ferrule fluid is dried up and they've been driven hard, they could be on their way out. Now, you can put new ferrule fluid in them. You got to pop the tweeter out to be able to get at that and do some disassembly, a little bit of surgery, but something to be aware of. Next, you've got these little kind of wires that go from the kind of side of the baffle plate through the baffle plate, and they go into the diaphragm, positive and negative wires. So just double check that this hasn't been mucked around. This has got like a black, almost rubbery sticker that goes over either. If it's been mucked up with, you probably see some black gooish stuff, and that could mean that the leads have been mucked around and can have a bad connection. So just double check that. Okay, so here's some reviews that I found on the speakers. We'll read through them, and then I'd like to compare it to what I thought about the speakers, and we'll determine whether or not this is accurate or not. So the Model 100 was its ability to reproduce the very lowest and very highest of musical frequencies with extreme linearity. The speaker's ability to reproduce any signal fed to it accurately with no exaggeration or deterioration. Excellent dispersion, filling any listening room with equal musical energy over the whole range of the speaker. Minimum distortion, both harmonic and intermodulational, to eliminate listening fatigue, and a cabinet design compact enough to fit in any bookshelf. Now, I don't know about fitting these in bookshelves. I know back in the day that was a big deal, but these will probably sound best on stands. Let's just kind of call it as it is. Now, before we comment on that, let's go on. So here's some other notes here. The Model 100's accurate tonal balance combined with exceptional dispersion makes it an ideal speaker for anyone who really enjoys live music. Whether you're listening to full symphony, thunderous rock, or progressive jazz, the Model 100 almost disappears, leaving only the music. An accomplishment very few speakers can, regardless of price, equal. Wow. Again, pretty tall order. The sound quality of the EPI, now this is from Stereo Review, 1970, was very natural and easy. The more we listened to it, the better we liked it. It was one of the most faithful reproducers we had the pleasure of hearing. The EPI 100 is comparable in most respects to some of the best and most expensive speaker systems we've ever tested. Wow. Again, some really great reviews on how these sound. Now, let me share with you how generally I thought they sounded, and then I'll go into some more detailed examples. So, yes, it is the type of speaker that when you sit down at first, your first reaction is probably going to be, it's pretty easygoing. You know, it's not bringing a lot of attention to it. Doesn't sound like it's doing anything really terribly. It's kind of like a, response. The more you listen to it, you start to admire some of the qualities, like the pretty decent bottom end these speakers can reproduce with very little distortion and not a lot of resonance, or they don't sound muddy when they do it. In fact, for a little 8-inch speaker in a steel cabinet, these produce some pretty thumping bass. And the high frequencies don't ever really get exaggerated. They don't ever really get bright or aggressive or in your face. And in fact, they do a good job just staying out of the way, letting the music come through and just really grab your attention at those moments when they should. Like when you're listening to a song and all of a sudden there's an acoustic guitar playing and you just kind of hear the fingers slipping over the strings, or there's some drum work going on and someone hits a cymbal or they get the ride cymbal going, you get that resonance and that decay. Those are the moments where you're sitting there just listening to these where you kind of look up and go, right? So they'll grab your attention at points, and you start to admire that more and more you listen to them. So I will agree this is an easygoing speaker that the more you listen to it, the better it seems to sound. You start to appreciate some of its traits, And yes, I will say they do a good job disappearing. That's one thing they did quite well, was creating a good center image and kind of getting out of the way and disappearing. I think, as good as a lot of speakers that I've heard, these can do just that. And quite frankly, for $200, these sound, you know, way too good for $200, even with some of their faults. So let's talk a little bit more in detail with what I heard when I really put these things through their paces. Okay, so let's get a little bit more critical on how these sounded. So the first thing I really noticed is a real full, punchy bass with these speakers. Um, that's just kind of the thing that jumped out at me as I thought, geez, these are a punchy little speaker. However, I thought the speaker sounded a little bit warm, maybe a little bit rolled off, and the vocals sounded a little bit recessed. They weren't kind of jumping out at me. And in fact, cymbals, sounded like they lacked a little bit of dynamics to them. That that definition wasn't there. There was a little bit crunchy sounding, and I thought, well, these wouldn't be bad for maybe some rock music or something like that. And in some tracks, they sound when things got busy, that some of the details again were lost. So again, I threw on a couple different tracks, trying to give them a chance. Put on Watermelon Man, jazz track. And I thought, well, all these things are kind of swinging. They're doing a good job with jazz. I found that they need a little bit of a bump in gain to kind of get the details that come out at you to make the speakers more memorable. At lower volumes, they're just kind of like, just there. The bass, again, very punchy sounding. The guitar sounded really quite convincing. And in this track, there's some cowbell and it had great resonance. Overall, I thought this is a pretty good presentation. So then I went to kind of a reference song for me, Dire Straits, You and Your Friend. I mean, anything should sound good with this track. But these speakers did not have that kind of eerie soundstage you get on a really good pair of speakers, where the echo and kind of the air just kind of surrounds you. So that soundstage wasn't there. The bass was pretty deep, so it was doing a good job hitting the lowest lows on the song. Rim shot sounded accurate, realistic. The vocals sounded better on this track. Overall, there was pretty good tone and an overall good sense of space. I gave it a 7 out of 10 for accuracy, but an 8 out of 10 for listenability. And I did note that the steel guitar on this track had excellent attack and great tone. I thought that it resonated and the chords lingered just enough. Now, Hotel California, the MTV mix, again, a great track. The drums sounded great. There was a nicely dampened bass drum. The rim shot sounded natural. The bongos were totally correct with good depth. I found the vocals were nicely centered and they were quite easy to listen to. The guitars were natural sounding. And again, I noted easy listening speaker. Now, I put on Private Investigations, again, Dire Straits, and I noted some great guitar plucking and effects overall. The drums sounded realistic. Again, this is a similar kind of theme here, right? But the vocals were a little bit recessed again, a little bit further than I would have liked to hear back. And again, I noticed this on a few tracks. Now, I listened to The Dark Side of the Moon. Yeah, not the greatest recording, but there is good percussion, nice presence and imaging during the intro in particular. The drums did get a little bit thin sounding during the track, and the vocals kind of lacked a little bit of sparkle. In fact, they were kind of bordering, sounding a little bit lifeless. Now I put on Alvin Lee, The Bluest Blue, and the vocals got better. I mean, this is a less complicated song. Overall, things were pretty full sounding. Again, good resonation, snappy snare drum, fairly big with a good sound stage. And I did make a kind of a last note here. I said, when criticizing, one must remember that this is a really small bookshelf. Overall, it's an honest sounding speaker, worth the small investment. Um, and I said these could have been sold at 2 or 3 times the price and would have been certainly right up there with many other speakers, for example, some of the small Advents that I've listened to. So overall, a pretty good sounding speaker, not perfect. They're not giant killers, but it's a good sounding speaker that's worth a listen. Definitely something that you might want to consider to have kind of as a backup, something in your arsenal. Maybe you get a small listening room or an office that you're looking for something that's going to do a good job. But remember, these do like a little bit of volume before you get that kind of engaging sound out of them. So keep that in mind. Overall, I think they might deserve a place in your vintage audio collection, but that's something that you got to decide yourself. Hey, thanks for joining. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and we will see you next time here on the Vintage Vibe.